Jackson Crawford, and I have the extraordinary privilege today of talking to you from Stofnun Árni Magnússonar í Íslenskum fræðum, the Árni Magnússon Institute for Icelandic Studies here in Reykjavik, Iceland. I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Haukur Þorgeirsson, Associate Research Professor here at the Institute. Is that correct?
It is, yes.
All right. Let's talk about what we have in front of us right now. This is, if I am not incorrect, one of the 4 medieval manuscripts of Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda.
Well, it's one of the major manuscripts of the Prose Edda. There are a few more. Well, it depends what you call the Prose Edda. So there are 4 medieval manuscripts that have gylfaginning. There are some more that have parts of skáldskaparmál. But maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit here.
Yeah, in case anyone comes to this not knowing or needing a refresher, tell us a little bit about what the Prose Edda or Snorri's Edda is, what the contents of this book are.
Yeah, of course. So this Prose Edda, the book that was originally called Edda, is an early 13th century work by the Icelandic magnate Snorri Sturluson. And it's a textbook on poetry and how to compose it. And it has an example. So one of the ideas about the Prose Edda is that it's composed in a different order than the order in which it is preserved. So Snorri was a poet himself, and he composed praise poems for the Norwegian king and the Jarl, the Earl Skúli, and some other people as well. And he wrote this poem, Háttatal, his list of meters, which is a part of the Prose Edda, and possibly the first part composed. But one idea goes, Snorri realizes once he has composed some poems that they're a bit hard to understand. So the knowledge needed to understand traditional Old Norse poetry is quite extensive, and it hadn't been codified before. So Snorri decides to do that. So he has this poem of his that is itself sort of didactic, in that each stanza has a different meter, or different style, various variations of the common Old Norse meters. And then he explains a bit the difference between the meters. This one has so and so many syllables, and this one has such and such a syntax and style, and so on. And then he starts explaining he apparently felt the need to explain the poetic diction, the language of poetry, skáldskaparmál. So that's another part of the Prose Edda. An explanation of the kennings that are such an important part of Old Norse quote poetry, and other Old Norse styles as well, and Icelandic poetry later on, even after the Middle Ages. Lots and lots of kennings were still being used. So, and he's explaining the way to understand kennings and to make new kennings. And in order to explain this, he also feels the need to explain the mythology, Norse mythology, because many of the kennings refer to myths about the gods and stories about heroes. And so that brings us to gylfaginning, the diluting of gylfi, which is Snorri's summary or account of the Old Norse myths. So there are some myths already in skáldskaparmál, but many more in gylfaginning. And also, even if the goal, the sort of declared goal of the Edda is to be a textbook on poetry, how to compose poetry, you can see that the author gets quite interested in the mythology itself as its own subject. So it wouldn't really have been necessary to tell the myths in such depth just to explain the poetry. So he probably felt it had some value of its own. And, a good story is a good story.
Absolutely. And of course you read about Snorri's life, and you do see some traces of that interest in mythology that's broader than just explaining poetry. Isn't there something in Sturlunga's saga where a woman tries to stab his dad's eye out and says, "I want to make you like Odin, the one that you resemble," and
that's true.
And didn't he call his booth at the Althing? Wasn't that Valhall?
Yeah. So he was probably a mythology buff even before he started writing this book. It's yeah.
I like to think that's one of the things that's really interesting about Snorri, is that in a sense he's the first one of us, if that makes sense, right?
You could see it that way, yeah.
But that's neither here nor there for the moment. What is this particular item physically before us here?
Right, so here we have a manuscript from the early 14th century that is called the Codex Regius of the Prose Edda. And so this often causes some confusion because the Codex Regius, it just means the king's book or royal book. So what this comes from here is that it was a book in the Royal Library in Copenhagen, but now it is here in the Stofnun Árni Magnússonar in Reykjavík. And there are many actually other books that were in the Royal Library, and some of them are also called Codex Regius, so it gets a bit confusing. But the thing here is that this is not the same book as the Codex Regius of the Poetic Edda, even though they actually look much alike. And that's another thing maybe to say about this manuscript, is that it is not enormously visually impressive. It's nice enough. It's written in a professional hand, and it has some initials. It's a fine book, but you can see the margins are very narrow. They were actually probably trimmed at some point, but even from the start they're probably narrow. So this is not a sumptuous book. This is not a no expense spared type of project. And that's the thing about Old Norse manuscripts, that the texts that are maybe most appreciated now or in post-medieval times, so the sagas of Icelanders and the Eddas, they were not, they're not the ones with the fanciest manuscripts. Those were the fancy manuscripts are the king sagas, some Christian literature, and some law books. But this was not written to be a fancy display object. It was written to be read, and we have many actually manuscripts of the Prose Edda. So we have depends on exactly what you count, maybe 7 medieval manuscripts. None of them preserved quite intact, but this one is very close to being intact.
It's missing only the first page, isn't that right?
It's missing the first page, yeah, that's right. So the first part of the prologue, but we know what it said from some later copies, and from comparison with other old manuscripts of the Prose Edda. And then we have actually lots of post-medieval manuscripts of the Prose Edda, because it remained a very popular work in Iceland, and then later on in the 17th century, in the mid-17th century, scholars in Scandinavia and elsewhere become interested in it. And it's printed first in 1665, which is very early for an Icelandic text to be printed, an Old Icelandic text.
Now, looking at this and considering the Codex Regius of the Poetic Edda, which is a little bit older than this.
Yeah.
I noticed that the orthography and paleography have changed somewhat.
Right, yeah. And that's the thing that we use to date manuscripts to begin with, mostly. So I tell you, well, it's early 14th century, and that's actually, it doesn't say anywhere in the book when it's written. It's just a surmise we draw from the paleography and the orthography.
This is getting toward, impressionistically, a more Gothic style and less Carolingian, although I see some of the abbreviations remain the same.
Right, yeah. And there is a lot of stability in Icelandic orthography through time.
Yeah, and it doesn't, just looking at it impressionistically right now, I don't see any major orthographic changes. It seems like things are being spelled about the same as I would expect in a manuscript from from the late 1200s, like the Codex book of the Poetic Edda.
Yeah, that's true. The orthography is quite similar. So, but you can, and you can actually see traces of sort of layers in the text of earlier orthography, because especially when the scribe is copying something he doesn't necessarily fully understand, like much of the poetry is so obscure, then he may sometimes copy sign by sign. So normally when a scribe copies a manuscript, they're updating the orthography as they go along to their standard, to their own present needs and the needs of their audience, which is the natural thing to do. But when you're copying some very obscure text, you may not be able to update the orthography properly. So we can see traces of 13th century orthography in this.
Well, and so, for example, one line that I see here is from the lost poem Heimdallr Galdur.
That's true.
Which is starting with a small capital N, Niu Emek Maidra Mogar. So we have kind of we're perched between an older and a later stage here. We have the genitive plural of mother written with a very distinct ash, a very distinct A-E ligature, which I actually would not expect from what I recall of reading the Codex Regius of the Poetic Edda. It seems like a later thing. Would you agree?
Right.
It reflecting the merger.
Yeah, so we can see certainly the merger of the ash and
Osh, I don't know.
I don't know what you call the other thing. Has happened by the stage this manuscript is written, but you do sometimes see traces of the earlier distinction again in some of the more obscure parts. But for a simple word that the scribe knows well, like Maidra, then he'll just go ahead and use ash.
And orthographically, I noticed we still have thorn in the middle of words, which of course would, I suppose by the end of the 1300s, that would be an either a D even.
Yeah, so thorn is early, then you might get an F, and then you'll get mostly D. Yeah. So this Maidra here is a neat example of that as well.
And then Mogar, or Mugur, depending on whether you want to say it Old Norse or Icelandic, we have the AU ligature for that old U mutated vowel, which I think of as a pretty old characteristic. So it's an interesting.
Well, it comes down to taste. So the AV or AU ligature is, well, it's not really a ligature here. It's just an AV, isn't it?
I suppose you're right. I mean, the A's tail sort of hits the V. I don't know if that counts as a ligature. Probably not.
Yeah, I'm not totally sure. But right, yes. So Niu Emek Maidra Mögur is what we would say in modern pronunciation. So reconstructed pronunciation, something more like Niu Emek Mödra Mor. But here I'm actually, well, it depends. Reconstructed to what time? So like Mödra would have been 12th century Icelandic, 13th century Icelandic. Then it changes to Medra, and then you get this Maidra, maybe in the well, it's hard to say, 15th century at least, maybe even earlier.
Yeah, the diphthongs. You start to see, for example, I think some of the earliest traces of those diphthongs are words like, say, Drengur, written with an EI.
Yeah. That's true, and you get that you get a lot of that already in the 14th century.
So it's a very, well, it's interesting because it's timeable. We can say this is early, this is late, but it's not, of course, signed in any way. There's no way to know who specifically wrote it or where, as far as I know.
No, it's we have no concrete information on that. All we really know is that the book was acquired by Bishop Brynjolfur in the 17th century and sent to Denmark. But you can speculate a bit on the origins of this manuscript, even though I'll refrain from doing it here. But I'll just say there is another manuscript written by apparently the same scribe. So that's AM 68 folio, which is in Copenhagen, a King Saga. manuscript. That's another thing with it's the vision of the Árni Magnússon collection. So the books that are specifically of interest to Iceland, so like the sagas of Icelanders, they were sent mostly here, but things like the King sagas, which deal with the history of Scandinavia, most of those are still in Copenhagen. So here's an example of this, where we have this book, the Edda, was repatriated to Iceland, and there was a lot of interest in getting the both the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda here. But the other book by the same scribe is in Copenhagen, so it would be nice to have them on the same desk to compare the writing a little bit better, but there we are.
That's also interesting. I wonder, I mean, if this is early 1300s, then we're within 1 to 3 generations of someone who could have known Snorri himself.
Yeah.
And an interesting thought. But also it seems like if he's copying both this and Heimskringla, if that's the King Saga.
Well, it's a text derived. The saga of Olaf Tryggvason is derived. It's sort of an expanded version of the Heimskringla account.
Is it the greatest saga of Olaf Tryggvason?
Is it the saga of Olaf Helgi? It's one of the Olafs. No, I'm not sure which it was.
but that shows an antiquarian interest, and actually interest much like Snorri's himself.
Yeah, but so why? And actually, some of the poetry in this book that's quoted in Skaldskaparmál is also in the other manuscript, the AM68 folio. So the same scribe would have written the same stanza more than once, which I think is sort of interesting. And but what were the interests of the scribe? So was the scribe personally interested in this? Probably he was commissioned to do this by someone. Did he work at a monastery? Where did he work?
Of course.
It's hard to tell, but he was presumably a professional.
Mm-hmm. And what is the relationship of this manuscript to other manuscripts of the Prose Edda from that are of scholarly use? I know that, for example, there's the U text, the Uppsaliensis text, which is shorter. Am I right?
Yeah, but it has a shorter version of Kilvakin and Skaldskaparmál, and not all of Hatatar. And then it has some other things as well. But yeah, that's a short text. It's true.
And there's been a lot of speculation about why is this text shorter, right? One of the ideas is that U is copied from a draft, which I've always thought is a kind of clever idea, hard to prove, impossible to prove. And then there's also the T text, right? The Triectinus text, and the W text, is that right? The Wormianus.
Yeah, and you can see these sort of 4 famous manuscripts are spread out over 4 European cities. So we have this in Reykjavik now. The Wormianus is still in Copenhagen, and then the Uppsaliensis in Uppsala, and Triectinus in Utrecht. So which actually goes to show again the interest in the Edda in Europe in the 17th century. So that's when these books ended up in these cities.
And the oldest manuscript is regarded as being, is that U?
U might be slightly older than this one. It's hard to tell for sure, because again there's no explicit dating in any of these books. We can just guess that the paleography of U seems maybe slightly older than R. The orthography, maybe not necessarily. And it's you have to reckon with quite a margin of error for this sort of thing, because a conservative scribe working at the same time as maybe younger scribe might appear to be producing an older book.
Of course, that makes perfect sense. These things can never be resolved perfectly in detail forever.
No, indeed. We just do our best.
And this is the manuscript that I understand is typically used as the basis for prepared modern editions of Snorri's Edda. Is that right?
Yes, that is true. So if you read an edition of if you read a printed edition of the Prose Edda, or a translation of the Prose Edda, you will be reading text that is based on this manuscript. Not this manuscript exclusively, but using it as the basis for the edition. And then there are different philosophies of how to edit a text, a medieval text, or any text. And so one idea is to base it as much as possible on one manuscript, and then you sort of correct it only when it seems incoherent, or where you're sort of really convinced that some other manuscripts have a better text that makes more sense, that text that must be more original. And then another approach is to sort of try harder to reconstruct something closer to the original based on all the evidence we have, all the manuscript witnesses we have. And the major editions of Snorra Edda, well, actually, again, the first printed edition from 1665 was not based on this manuscript, although it used it a little bit. It was based on the Codex Wormianus, or rather, it was based on a 17th century reworking of the Codex Wormianus. So there's lots of stuff out there, but what's the upshot, right? So we this is also abstract. So what's the difference between the manuscripts anyway? Is what you might want to know, and so maybe we could do with some examples. So first, the structure. So this one has it starts with this prologue, and it has Gylfaginning, and the Skaldskapamál, and then it has the Nafnaþulur, the list of names for things, and then the Háttatal. So this is traditionally the Prose Edda, the one you'll see edited and printed and translated. But actually this manuscript has a couple more things. It has a couple of poems at the end that are not found in other Snorra Edda manuscripts, and you'll not find them in the Snorra Edda editions, because the editor decides sensibly that's not part of the Edda proper. It's just a couple of poems that the scribe of this manuscript, for whatever reason, chose to include. Right.
What is the content of those?
Right. So those are two poems that may be Orcadian, maybe composed in the Orkneys. So that's Jómsvíkingadrápa, the praise poem about the Jómsvíkingar, and then there's Málsháttakvæði, so a list of sayings with some end rhyme. Very interesting poem actually, and it has neither of those poems was probably composed in Iceland. So I think they were both composed in the Orkneys, but they're only preserved in this in Icelandic manuscripts, in particular in this one.
Well, there seems to be almost a tradition with Prose Edda manuscripts of including little extras.
Exactly.
Of material that would probably have been interesting to Snorri, or to a medieval audience that was interested in his work. Is it W that includes Rigsthula?
Yeah, it does. So actually, all of the Prose Edda manuscripts have their own thing, you might say. I guess you could say the Trajatinus, which is late 16th century paper manuscript actually, but still very important textually, because it's a copy of a 13th century manuscript, it seems. So the orthography is this glorious mix of late 16th century Icelandic orthography and then a lot of mid 13th century traits. And that one actually has the Edda straight as you get it printed, with just the prologue, the Gylfaginning, Skaldskapamál, Nafnaþulur, Háttatal. But every other old manuscript has some other things as well. So the Wormianus has Rigsthula, that's one thing. It's included, so an Eddic poem. Then you have actually, Wormianus has this reworked text of Skaldskapamál, written in the 14th century. And you can see the Edda being regarded as sort of a very alive text. It's not this wholly antiquarian object that you're to copy precisely and hand down as you got it. It's a text that is alive, something that you might want to add to, that it is actively being used as a handbook for poets, and that you might want to add some quotations of your own and some ideas for cannings and so on. So that the Wormianus has that. It also has some other learning. It has the 4 grammatical treatises, as they're called, which you can see the contents are somewhat related to the to Snorri's Edda. So in particular, the 3rd and 4th grammatical treatises have lots and lots of citations of skaldic poetry to exemplify various rhetorical tropes or tricks. So, and then they're working some classical learning into this. They're using Priscian and Donatus as well, partially the 3rd grammatical treatise is a translation of these classical texts on rhetoric, and they're applying it to Old Norse poetry. So, okay, they have this classical trick that we also have in Old Norse poetry. So we're just as good poets as they are. So Snorri doesn't do this. He doesn't go so heavy on the classical models, though he does have this introduction.
Right. I guess that's his classical model. It's the Iliad, pretty much.
Yeah. Because he does also show that actually the Aesir are from Asia, and they're bringing this old from Troy and all this good stuff from classical antiquity.
800 years later, this is still confusing people.
Right, yeah.
I still meet people who will start reading there and then contextualize all of Norse mythology as something derived from the Trojan War. Snorri did a nice job of making it slightly convincing.
Yeah, well, everyone was doing it. So you have many European texts that do this, sort of to try to trace their local or national heroes back to Troy. But we were talking about the differences between the Prose Edda manuscripts. So the Uppsaliensis manuscript again has this has the material in a slightly different order. So another attempt to maybe improve the text and make it more approachable for a certain audience. Hard to tell exactly what they were trying to do there. And then we have actually an interesting manuscript, AM 7481 B quarto. So it doesn't have this handy name, so we just have this long shelf mark. It's called A in Finnur Jonsson's edition, and many other works as well, so maybe I'll just call it A. So A is also early 14th century, and also includes the 3rd grammatical treatise, like Wormianus. And it has a sort of rewritten again version of Skaldskaparmál, where you sort of removed much of the mythology. So it doesn't have Gylfaginning at all. So it's a slightly different approach, maybe somewhat more practical for a certain audience, so you don't actually need to explain the myths so carefully, just to learn some cannings. Okay.
People are very interested in how you get from this, which obviously doesn't look like what's on the printed page, to what is on the printed page. So perhaps we can talk about this, starting with the initial H in Heimdallr. Now we see that name spelled out completely. We see a large initial because this is starting another small subsection. Right? But then the next word, it seems to me, is abbreviated. Is that a Han? The H
yes, that's
marker
true.
there. Han.
Let's see, this one's a little bit unclear, isn't it? Sorry, the H dot is not Han, we have that later on, so the H dot stands for heitir.
Oh, heitir, okay, and then Eiten.
Yeah, Heimdallr heitir, so Heimdallr is the name of one of the gods.
And so of course we have the capital N, that shows that it's 2 N's, masculine Eiten, not feminine Ein.
Exactly.
Then we have Han. I see.
Yeah.
All right, so we have 2 different H abbreviations there. The H with a little bit more of a bar is Han. Han and then it looks like we maybe have an original blemish on the page.
Yeah.
Because the next word is spaced quite widely.
Yeah, maybe there's been some repair there, I'm not quite sure. But we have definitely Heimdallr. Heimdallur heitir einn, hann kallaður hvíti ás. So Heimdallur is the name of one, he is called the white god. And so why is he called the white god is of course an interesting question. And then it proceeds with another abbreviated hann. So these common words are very often abbreviated in Icelandic manuscripts. Hann mikill og heilagur, he is great and holy. Hann báru að what is it doing here?
Is that báru at Sinni as a son? S-Y-N-I?
Sini, right, so it's an an. Yeah, hann báru að Sini megar níu. So,
alright, so
as an example of where the manuscripts have some differences, I want to look at this passage about the god Njörður and his wife Skadi.
I see your names here. Njörður. Álfell konu Skadi heitir.
Exactly. Njörður has a wife named Skadi. And then we read on, and Skadi vill hafa bústað þann áður hafði faðir hennar átt. Skadi wants to have the place to live which her father had before. Það á fjöllum nokkurum, þar sem heitir Þrumheimur. It is on certain mountains called Þrumheimur. And Njörður vill vera nær sæ, but Njörður wants to be closer to the sea. Þau sættust á að þau skildu vera 9 vetur í Þrumheimi en þá aðra 9 að Nóatúnum. So they came to the agreement that they should stay 9 winters in Þrumheimur and another 9 in Nóatún. And so this is what it says in this manuscript. So they stay 9 winters in one place and then 9 winters in the other place. And actually, if you look at the other 3 important manuscripts of Gylfaginning, they all have a different text. They say it's not winters, it's nights. So they stay 9 nights in Þrumheimur and then they switch. And it's not 9 in the in Nóatún, it's actually 3. So, and here we come to an example of something interesting for an editor to do. So you're using this manuscript for your edition maybe. So are you going to print this text, or are you going to use the text from the other manuscripts here? So how do you decide this sort of thing? So one consideration in traditional editing is what is the relationship between these manuscripts. So like if this was the oldest manuscript and all the others were copied from it, right, then there would be maybe no need to listen to the other ones, we just do this one. But that's not what we think is going on here. We think all the others have some independent value as well. And so we can have some ideas of what the relationship is. So this Codex Regius manuscript actually, its text seems to be quite closely related to that of the Trajectinus manuscript, more distantly related to the Wormianus manuscript, and more distantly still to the Upsaliensis manuscript. So you can put this in a little diagram that's called a stemma. And so what this suggests is that, if this stemma is correct, then we would think if all the other manuscripts agree on some reading, it's probably part of the original, or at least the archetype, the manuscript from which all preserved manuscripts are derived. So if we are trying to get closer to the original text, maybe we want to prefer the text of the other manuscripts in cases like this, where they all agree against this manuscript. So in that case, we would print 9 nights and then 3 nights. But also, you can go sort of a middle road here, which some editors have done, and they've said, well, winters is obviously an error. And you can see what sort of error it is. You can see vetur is written, so V-E-T-R, and one way to write nightur, nights, is to write N-E-T-R. And U and N, or V and N, look very similar.
Of course.
So it's an easy mistake to make. So maybe you say, well, vetur must be a mistake for nightur, so let's correct that. But maybe you think it's not as obvious that 9 is a mistake for 3.
Right.
So you can see some editions of the Prose Edda where you have, okay, they stay 9 nights in one place and then 9 nights in the other place. And so no preserved manuscript has that text,
of course.
which is fine. You often editors often do this. They combine information from different manuscripts. But I personally think I would go further here and say it's 9 nights and then 3 nights, which is the majority reading. And also, I think there's a good case to be made for it mythologically, that it makes more sense that way. So maybe it's the 9 nights in one place is the winter, the 9 months of winter, and then 3 months of summer. That's one interpretation of this. And you can see some parallels in other texts that actually I think support this 9-3 division. So check your translations of the Prose Edda or edition, whatever you're using. See what it says here. Does it have 9 nights and 9 nights, or does it have 9 and 3? Because you can find both cases of both.
What an excellent example of the challenges that we find in editing or translating from complicated manuscript traditions like this. And of course, the complications in the Prose Edda manuscript tradition are nothing next to the New Testament tradition or something like that. But it's an excellent example of something that plagues anyone trying to make an edition.
Definitely.
Now you yourself are working on an edition of the Prose Edda.
Yeah, I am, for the Icelandic series of books.
It is a privilege, by the way, to be sitting here with an editor for Icelandic.
Thank you. Happy to meet you as well, Jackson.
Well, the decision you've made for that edition will be 9 and 3.
Yeah, I think there's a very good case to be made for that. And also, generally speaking, my approach here is to try to use all the evidence, and especially so this is a very important manuscript, so again we will be using it as some sort of base, but in cases where the other important manuscripts agree against it on some other reading, I think that reading is more likely to be closer to the original, and so we will be for the most part printing those readings. So often it is this one is something where you might the interpretation of mythology and so on might be affected. Quite an interesting example, I think. But of course, many other examples are just minor differences in wording, nothing that maybe fundamentally changes the meaning, just the order of words, or slightly different way to say something. But still, there are certainly other examples like this where the meaning, matters. Well, the text you pick, the text you edit, will affect. Like, for example, a translation made from this text will be slightly different than a translation made from some other text.
And someone says, "Well, my translation says this," and someone says, "Well, my translation says this," and you're wrong. Well, the basis of it is not wrong. It's different decisions made from different manuscripts.
Exactly. And so, ideally, you'll have some footnotes as well on the most maybe interesting differences between the manuscripts. And another thing that I want to sort of accomplish in this edition is, so actually the Icelandic editors, they asked us to include the grammatical treatises as well.
Excellent.
Which we will, and I think that's a good thing to do. And also, there are some texts in some of these. Again, we were talking about the differences between the Edda manuscripts. Some of them have different versions or some additional texts. So we're going to print some of those that you might not always see included in. So you'll get something more than the sort of pared down basic Edda. You'll get these additional and variant texts as well. So, for example, the A manuscript I mentioned earlier, and there's a B manuscript as well, which has some of this as well, has a text called Litla Skalda, so the little Skaldskapamál, sort of.
Yeah.
And it has a section on Fenrisúlfur, and these are there's some debate about this text. So is this? So one idea was, this is some later reworking of the Edda, but another theory, which I think is actually more convincing, is that this might be prior to the Edda, a prior attempt to set down some information on kennings and mythology. So we'll be printing this as well. So this is something that I don't believe, for example, has ever been translated.
I don't know of any translation, no.
And A also has like an alternative version of an alternative description of the place where Hel lives. So the
interesting.
Death figure. So we'll have that. So we'll have some texts that maybe a little less known, but I think which will be of interest to readers of the Edda.
I'll be very excited to see that. Really, like now you've hyped me up. When do you think this edition will be ready?
Oh, this should be a couple of years down the road.
Okay, a couple of years doesn't sound too bad.
Let's hope it comes true.
I know how these things can go.
It takes a lot of time because there are, and again, we're trying to really do this carefully with the basis, the textual basis for the edition. So there are many manuscripts. So again, traditionally 7 important ones, but there are a few more that have some value, especially copies of the principal manuscripts in places where they're damaged. Important to look at that. And then there are some there are some paper leaves in the Codex Wormianus that have traditionally been seen as a copy of Trajectinus, but I think actually they have they're a sister to the Trajectinus, not a copy.
Interesting.
So a few more witnesses maybe. Nothing that fundamentally changes things, but still, as an editor, you're always trying to do things a little more carefully than your predecessors.
Yes. To
have some squeeze a little more out of the manuscripts.
God, I'm looking forward to seeing what you've done. Seriously. Just thinking about what else is out there. I guess typically I've used Falks, which is a good addition. Yeah. But what you are talking about with Icelandic Studies, knowing the other editions from Icelandic Studies, this is going to be exactly what I need.
That's great to hear. So Fox, you can use Fox. That's a good addition, and also you can sort of think a bit about the philosophy here, because if you read his introduction, and what he says he's doing is that he's doing this methodology where you're basing your text as much as you can on one manuscript, on this very manuscript, in fact. And this is fine, and this has a certain use, and but also he's done that. And so that's one reason actually I want to try to do things a little bit differently and to use the other manuscripts a bit more. So my text, or our text, I'm working with my father on this actually, Dr. Haukur Þorgeirsson, and our text will be will take the other manuscripts more into account.
Excellent. I am legitimately extremely excited to see this. Let's talk a little bit more about what's in front of us today. We had a couple other pages that we had planned to talk about in particular.
Right. So we've done Gylfaginning here with some mythology on Heimdallur and Njörður. So let's go over to Skáldskaparmál.
As an aside, while we're talking about this, you said there's a unique pagination to this manuscript. Were page numbers added at some point?
Yeah. So some of our predecessors added page numbers, and sometimes line numbers as well, as you can see here. So
I see.
Page 62 and line 8, 9, 10. So
interesting. Is this probably 1600s, 1700s? 1800s?
Yeah, no, probably not 1800s. It might be 17th century work. Might also be 18th century. Right. So here I'll pin down this page of the manuscript I want to look at with these bookworms. And one thing people often ask about is, are you using your bare hands for this, or is it better to use gloves? So current thinking is that clean hands, so I washed my hands very carefully before doing this, that clean hands are better than gloves. Your touch is sensitive when you're using your bare hands. So if I'm wearing gloves, I can't feel the page quite as well, and might be more prone to having an accident and tear something.
And of course, only you're touching it. It's not necessary for me to, so I refrain.
Right. So here we have some stuff from Skáldskaparmál, which is has a lot of interesting citations of poetry. And so one I wanted to look at here in particular is a citation from Bragi hinn gamli. So
I see the name right there, right now, Lothbrok.
Exactly. So Bragi hinn gamli orti fall Sörla og Hamdis í drápi þeirri hann orti Ragnar Lothbrok. So Bragi the Old composed a poem Well, he composed a part about Sörli and Hamdir, this story he's been telling here in Skálskapamál, in the Ragnarsdrápa. So the traditional chronology here is that this is 9th century poet, Bragi, the oldest poet that we have anything preserved by in Old Norse, and I think that's actually likely to be true.
Mm.
So linguistically, it is certainly the most archaic poem we have, or the stanzas and partial poems, the stanzas and sequences of stanzas that are attributed to Bragi definitely have a very particular style that's unlike anything else. So both linguistically, very archaic, also the structure of the Þróttkvætt stanzas there is different, and seems to show maybe an earlier stage in the development of Old Norse court poetry.
Am I right that the Þróttkvætt there is a little bit less strict?
Yeah, from the perspective of the later times, we'd say that. So you're not obligated to have a rhyme in the odd lines, and you can have the rhythm can be a little bit different. You can have lines beginning with so the even lines can begin with weakly stressed syllable that you wouldn't usually find later on.
What's an archaic linguistic characteristic in Ragnarsdrápa?
Well, so one thing that has been much discussed in the chronology of Old Norse poetry is the so-called particle or expletive particle of So this word, if you have a lot of it, that indicates a high age. That's an old poem, and so Bragi citations have a lot of this. But also another interesting thing is the rhyme. You can see that he had a long initial syllable in the word höfuð, had. So
Haukur.
yeah.
Huh.
So you can see both from the rhyme and from the syllable weight that it was a heavy syllable, which is like you have in German, Haupt. So, but you don't have this in any other Old Norse.
I see Haukur. That was just.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Okay.
And I could go on. There are actually several ways in which the Ragnarsdrápa is different from everything else, and not in a way that you think someone would be faking it later on or something like that. So another curiosity is it has the word Valröf.
That's on the Rökk
This is on the Rökkstone as well, also a 9th century artifact.
That's cool. That's a very cool connection.
And there are actually, there are some more things in common, I think, with the language of the Rökkstone and with Bragi. So I think, as a linguist, I think there's every reason to believe that this is authentically a very old poem. So probably the oldest Old Norse poem we have.
This is a whole video we need to do one day.
That would be fun.
But one reason we wanted to pull this up for this video is to show how poetry is presented in the manuscript.
That's right.
Not with line divisions.
No, you use the space very efficiently here. So the poem, or the citation of this bit of the poem, starts with this large K here. And you can see it has a little bit of extra space before that, but that's all you're going to get here as a graphical indication that something is happening. And then we start reading Knátti erfir illan jörmun rekkrað vakna við dreyrfáar dróttir draun í sverða flaumi rósta varð í ranni rand við söfðu niðja þá hrafnbláir hendu harma erps of barmar. So that was the first stanza written out in these 3 lines. And then you have a little dot, and that's all you're going to get, and then you get the next stanza.
And of course this is from a version of the story that we see, for example, in Eddukvæði in Hamdismál.
Exactly, yeah. And other Germanic sources as well. This must have been a very old story as well.
And of course I see the word Hrafnbláur, which is of great interest to me in my
you're a color specialist, that's true.
Well,
so the raven blue or raven black, or however you want to translate that.
I insist on blue, but that's also another subject, I suppose. But it's very cool to see it right there in an original manuscript. Right,
so here we're looking at poetic synonyms. So again, before we were talking about this whole kenning system, that we have these circumlocutions. Thor is the son of Odin, and he is the son of earth and so on. So that's a very simple example of kenning. But then you also have poetic synonyms, just different words for the same thing, and in particular different names for mythological beings. So for the gods, like here we have Þór heitir Atli og Ásabragur, sá ennilangur og eindreiði, Björn hlóriði. So here's a bunch of names for Thor, synonyms that you could use. And for a poet, it's very practical to have synonyms, because you might want to mention Thor, but maybe you don't want to alliterate with thorn. You want to alliterate with a vowel, so maybe Atli suits your needs. Maybe you need 2 syllables, maybe you need 3 syllables, you need a heavy syllable, you need a light syllable, you might need all sorts of things. So it's very practical to have a name for every purpose. And so the synonyms are here presented in a slightly poetic way, so these are alliterating þulur, nafnaþulur, and you might learn this by heart if you like. And also this is probably something that existed before the Edda was composed. So people are probably using this. Some of these þulur probably in the 12th century, there's some probably even earlier than that. You can see in Völuspá there's a list of names of dwarves. So there's probably a long tradition of making these name lists that are again practical for poets, and found here in the Codex Regius of the Prose Edda and other Edda manuscripts as well. So you have some of the other manuscripts of the Edda actually have even more þulur. So this was definitely considered to be one of the most practical parts of the Edda.
Of course, which in so many ways, in its original intent, is a manual for poets.
Exactly, it's a manual for poets. So one question you might ask actually is was it successful as a manual for poets? So sometimes you see it presented, Snorri wanted to save Old Norse quote poetry, and it didn't really work because, by the 14th century, no Icelander is, writing poems on the kings of Norway or Denmark or Sweden anymore. So that's partly, no doubt, just changing fashions, partly the languages were moving further apart. So already in the 13th century, of course, anything Snorri was saying at the any poem Snorri or his colleagues were reciting at the courts in Norway would have been a challenge for the people there to understand. Not because Icelandic and Norwegian were so different, they were a little different, we know a bunch of small differences, but the poetic language was very obscure, so you had to have a culture where people were willing to, where there's a lot of prestige in this tradition, so you can have kings and magnates, or at least their courtiers, willing to learn this and understand it, or there's not much point. So at some point people ceased to be willing to deal with these weird Icelanders and their poems, but the tradition continued in Iceland. So even if the Edda might not have been able to save Old Norse court poetry as a going concern, it certainly was very popular in Iceland as a manual for poetry and mythology. And you can see the Icelandic poets use this a lot. So the secular poets, the poets that are composing about composing epics, the rímur in particular, so that the end-rhymed, also alliterative, but also end-rhymed epic poems based on the legendary sagas and chivalric sagas, that sort of thing. So they use kennings a lot, and so that's a tradition that continues. 14th century, 15th century, 16th century, 17th century, 18th century, 19th century. You have like 1,000 rímur epics, long poems, lots and lots of literature, and this all uses kennings, and they all talk about the Edda. They're always talking about, I don't really know the Edda is sort of a common way to start your poem, and it's always a lie, because you obviously do know the Edda, you have all these kennings, and you wouldn't be mentioning the Edda if you didn't think it was important.
So in some sense, for some centuries going, this was a successful attempt to revive part of the old Icelandic poetic tradition.
I think so. It was a prestigious book. Again, you have 7 medieval manuscripts, which is actually quite a lot by Icelandic standards. So many important Old Icelandic texts are only preserved in one manuscript. So 7 is reasonably impressive. And then in the 17th century you have not only the first printed edition, but also the manuscript edition continues. People copy it out, you get this early 17th century adaptation of the Edda, the Laufás Edda, where it's arranged in alphabetical order, and you're sort of adding some things, fiddling a little with it. So people keep making their own versions of the Edda in the 17th and 18th century, and they keep using it.
That's fascinating, and a huge contrast to something like the poems of the Poetic Edda, which didn't have the same continuous tradition in being passed down in writing.
Right, so that is a little different, that's true, but also so in that case we only have, depending on what you count, 2 or 3 medieval manuscripts of the Poetic Edda. So you have mostly the Codex Regius, then you have the AIM 7481A quarto in Copenhagen, and then you have the Völsunga which is clearly based on, has a bunch of Eddic poetry and is paraphrases.
And the Högsbok text of Völuspá.
Högsbok text of Völuspá, that's true, and you have Rigstöla and Vormi as well. You have some manuscripts, and but do you have a continuous tradition of Eddic poetry? Actually, so this is a little known, but in the 17th century, when people started collecting ballads in Iceland, they also collected some alliterative poems that have quite a lot in common with the Eddic poems. So Eddic fairy tales is what I'm calling them. Sagnakvæði is another word.
Well, it has been a huge privilege to take a look at the R text of the Prose Edda with Haukur Þorgeirsson, and I cannot imagine a better guide to the Prose Edda or its manuscript.
Thank you, that's very kind. It's been my pleasure as well.
Well, an honor, a privilege, and a pleasure for me, and I'm sure for our viewers. And from beautiful Iceland, we're wishing you all the best.
Bless.